It's difficult to tell now, but some of the heat waves we've experienced over the past couple of years were thought to be impossible 50 to 60 years ago. And we're now seeing natural disasters around the world that are being caused by two or more consequences from climate change. So, for instance, drought would be brought on by extreme heat waves and a lack of rain for extended periods of time. A new science field that tracks climate change attributed disasters will help inform policymakers on how to handle coastal management, reservoirs, and aquifers in this new future if we are not able to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of the century. So, we're going to talk about this new field of science. We're also going to talk about what it means for us in the future, all on this episode of How to Protect the Ocean. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, what you can do to speak up for the ocean, and how you can live for a better ocean by taking action. We got an exciting episode for you today. A new field of science is kind of brewing, and it's because of climate change. It's all about trying to attribute climate change effects to natural disasters. Now, you're probably wondering, like, wow, that's pretty depressing, Andrew. Why would you even think about that? Because we're seeing the process. I'm not sure if you've looked at the news. I know there's a lot of stuff going on in the news right now, but the California coastline had a huge storm all the way from the northern California down to Southern California. In Northern California, I think it was a big windstorm that knocked out power for many places around the coastline and just inside the coastline, as well as down in like the Santa Barbara area. There's massive flooding from huge rain and storm surge. I know on one of the accounts that I follow, Forrest Galante, he lives just in Santa Barbara, and he lives off a river. It's not like a huge river by any means. I don't know the name of the river that he lives off of, but he's got on his property, he's got like a little bridge that you have to drive over, you have to go over to get to your property, and that bridge is basically flooded. And the amount of water that's coming out, it seems pretty scary. He didn't seem pretty scared, and that's Forrest. Like he's a pretty adventurous type of person. But it's the road to his property, and so that's a big deal. And a lot of people are facing similar things, but maybe with less control. I don't know what's happening with Forrest. I hope that everything is okay and on his property. But that's something that we are now considering, right? We are seeing this happen more often than not. When we look at the news, there are droughts, there are forest fires and wildfires that are going along the west coast of North America. We're also seeing wildfires in Australia. We're seeing floods. We're seeing storm surges. We're seeing heavy rains. Or in other areas, we're seeing no rain for an extended period of time. California went through a massive drought in 2021, huge drought. And so what we're finding here in this article on NPR kind of lays it out perfectly, and I'll put the article in the show notes, the link to the article in the show notes, is it's basically saying, look, climate change is here and it's getting worse, right? And until we start, we've already increased, the temperature globally by 2 degrees, about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than it was in the late 1800s. So scientists are warning that humans must cut gas emissions by half this decade to avoid catastrophic warming later this century. So we actually have to do a lot more cutting, which, let's be honest, when you look at the politics around the whole climate change thing and the policy that's needed to cut it, we're seeing policy in place, but we haven't seen the drastic cuts. It's not really happening. I think a lot of countries now, including my own Canada, are saying, hey, well, we saw a drop in 2020, like 2019, 2020, maybe even 2021. Well, that's because there was a global pandemic and people weren't traveling. So that makes sense. People weren't going outside. They were isolated in their homes for the most part. And so we saw a lot of environmental sort of fixes, let's just say, or a lot of increases in environmental quality, air quality, and so forth. But let's be honest, that's temporary. As COVID still is around, it seems, quote unquote, that we're starting to live with it and we're starting to figure things out. And it's not as bad as it used to be based on, vaccines and so forth because of modern medicine, let's just say. But before that, in Canada, we saw an increase in greenhouse gas emissions every single year, and so that is scary. And we're seeing a drop in, according to Canadian politicians in the government, the Liberal Party, Trudeau and his counterparts, or his colleagues, we're supposed to be dropping now from now on every year. And to see that drop will be interesting. I'm hopeful, but just based on disappointment of politicians before, you just never know, right? So I'm cautiously optimistic. Now, getting back to this article, we're seeing the effects of climate change more than we have yet. It used to be in the 90s, we used to get like every once in a while, every 5 or 6 years, maybe every 10 years, we would see like a big heat wave. We'd be like, oh, it's been the hottest year ever. Well, in the last 8 years, it's been the hottest year every single year that we've seen on this planet. That's not helping our cause. That's not helping the fact that, we should be seeing less of these natural disasters, essentially, right? These localized natural disasters. And so, when we look at this kind of stuff, how do you track it? How do you, it's very, I always have questions from people. It's like, well, how do you know that the natural disasters we've seen today are because of climate change? How do we know it's just not sort of like these are natural disasters? This is what happens. We get heavy rains every once in a while. We get heat waves. We get storm surges. We get, rains, like heavy rains, droughts, that kind of stuff, wildfires. How do we know it's because of climate change? Well, there's a new report by the American Meteorological Society, AMS, and it basically it's by the top climate scientists and meteorologists in the country that describes how climate change drove unprecedented heat waves, floods, droughts in recent years. So the annual report from this organization, from the society, compiles the leading science about the role of climate change in extreme weather. And so Sarah Kapnick, who's the chief scientist at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, says it's a reminder that the risk of extreme events is growing and they're affecting every corner of the world. I've seen it here in Ontario, where the Great Lakes flooded, Lake Ontario flooded a couple years back, and it did that like 2-3 years after. And it made major flooding around the coastline of Lake Ontario. We hadn't seen that in a long time. That would happen every couple of 100 years. And we didn't really see that. They were like based on 100-year storms. And so what we're looking at here it says one way to understand and predict the effects of a hotter Earth is to look for fingerprints of climate change on extreme weather events such as floods, heat waves, and droughts. So the last decade has seen huge leaps forward for the field known as extreme event attribution science. So which is basically uses statistics and climate models to detect global warming's impact on weather disasters. So the extreme drought in California and Nevada in 2021, for example, was 6 times more likely because of climate change. And when they talk about that further in the article, they talk about how it was coupled between climate change extreme heat event and climate change lack of rain. And so those were in the same area. So that just became that much more likely for this drought to happen because of those two things. But they make each other worse. So when we talk about cumulative effects when we talk about ocean conservation, and this is what we're talking about here. What we look at is we're saying, okay, it's difficult to find out what's happening to this one coastline, say a one coral reef area, because you're looking at marine pollution, you're looking at ocean users, scuba divers and snorkelers. You're looking at what else is happening. Is there oil and gas in the area? Have there been any spills? Is there some mining, like sand mining or anything like that going on? Overfishing, that kind of stuff. All those can contribute to, and then climate change, all those can contribute to a degraded habitat. So what we try and do as conservationists and policymakers is we say, okay, let's cordon off this area with an imaginary boundary in the ocean. And we'll do a specific area. And we won't allow fishing. We won't allow any kind of diving or anything like that is human related. That's extractive. And so, okay, great. Nothing allowed. Now, you can't keep marine pollution out there, and you can't keep the effects of climate change to affect it, but you can take away those other things, and you can see how much of those those aspects have changed taking away those aspects, how much or those users, how much has it changed for the habitat? Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? Or is it staying the same? That can tell you whether that attribute, that ocean usage, is actually bothering that coral reef. Well, it's the same thing with climate change and the same thing with these natural disasters, these extreme weather events or these extreme events. You can look at, is the heat rising for longer periods of time every year, and then how much precipitation is there, right? Looking at those two things happening at the same time. Okay, now we've got, a drought that's extended for like a year, and it's affecting everybody, but these two things are happening at the same time. So that makes it even worse. It's like when we had the El Nino year, and then we had the heat blob essentially in northern Pacific Ocean. Bringing those two together really affected the weather patterns along the West Coast and really changed the weather and the climate along the West Coast for those couple of years. So that made it better. Another example is in October 2021, parts of South Korea experienced average temperatures that were 7 degrees Fahrenheit higher than average. In the past, they would have been exceedingly rare heat waves, something that would never occur twice in a millennium, let alone in a person's life. But scientists found that if humans do not dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such heat waves in South Korea will be a new norm by 2060. So in other words, it's not going to happen every once in a millennia. It's going to happen every year. It's going to happen every 2 years. It's going to happen every 6 months. We don't know, right? And so they say the connection between climate change and heat waves is particularly well understood and documented, in part because rising temperatures are relatively simple to measure and predict. Other types that are more complex, such as climate change affects hurricanes, for instance, in many ways. So from changing the temperature of the air and the water to potentially affecting wind patterns and ocean currents. For that reason, scientists tend to focus on individual effects of a storm. So if a hurricane's happening, what they do is they'll measure coastal flooding from storm surge and sea level rise, or inland flooding from abnormally heavy rains. So such floods are particularly dangerous when they occur at the same time. So Hurricane Ian brought both extreme storm surge and extreme rain to Florida last year, which led to deadly and destructive flooding across a huge swath of the state. So not only did you have storm surges and sea level rise flooding, but you also had flooding from heavy rains. So that got most of that not only got the coastal areas, but also got the inland areas. So that's a big deal. So compound events lead to exacerbated impacts. So that's what they're looking at. They said the mega drought in the western U.S. is a prime example. The drought that was caused by simultaneously extreme heat and lack of precipitation, that in turn causes a cascade of other hazards, including more wildfire risk and ecological destruction. So you're looking at these major events that are happening and the consequences that come around from them. Really what we're looking at is the knowledge of what happens with these areas, being able to predict what could happen, the consequences from two climate change effects, whether it be a heat wave, whether it be lack of precipitation, or the opposite, storm surges from major storms like hurricanes or cyclones, because of increased sea level rises and increased storm surges, and even increased rains can really affect flooding in an area. So knowing what this is going to cause, knowing and being able to predict, the consequences from that, wildfires, flooding, whatever that might be, can help us prepare better when we look at policies. But it really is going to depend on our political leaders to put those policies into place, right? To make them as regulations, to make them as law, to prep. Because right now, we're feeling the effects. It's costing us trillions of dollars, right? This is not going to be an easy thing to get around. We talk about let's look at emergency funds. Let's look at where our taxpayer money is going. It's going to go more and more to paying for the cleanups of these areas. Think about flooding in most of the state of Florida. How much money that costs to clean all that stuff up, right? All the dead animals, right? The debris, all the stuff that comes out from ocean water getting into inland. That cleanup is not easy to do, and it costs money. There's a cost to that. So we need to look for more of this extreme event science field that's growing is going to be necessary to be able to put policy into place to better prepare us for a hotter future by informing decisions about how to manage reservoirs, aquifers, and other water resources in places that face increasingly frequent and severe droughts. And that's what the report from the AMS is bringing about, is to bring about that awareness and that need for this type of work. Okay, so that's it for today's episode. I'd love to hear what you think about this new science field. Do you think it's necessary? Do you think it's blowing things out of proportion? Do you think we don't pay enough, or do you know how much we even pay in terms of like each country, in terms of, climate change, disasters, and so forth? Love to hear your thoughts on this. You can hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect an Ocean, or How to Protect the Ocean, and just hit me up. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Or you can just email me by going to speakupforblue.com and just picking going to contact us. I would love to hear from you. I've been getting some great emails lately with some suggestions of episodes and topics to cover, as well as some people who are looking to be interviewed. So please feel free to contact me through there, and I'm looking forward to getting in touch with you. So thank you very much for listening to this episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.